The methods section of an empirical paper is meant to outline specifically how you did your study. Thus, the goal is to provide enough detail that any other person could, hypothetically, replicate the study exactly. This means that in some places the methods section will be extremely specific. For instance, check out this study by Massaro and colleagues. They used eye tracking software to collect data on a subject's attending to a particular feature of a stimulus. Guess what is in their methods section? They provide very specific information about exactly what program they used and exactly which version of that program they used. Imagine if in 15 years we discovered that there was some problem with that software. By knowing the version they used, we can quickly determine which study's findings are compromised by that error. They also presented data on exactly where the eye tracking device is placed in relation to the participant. They describe how far away it is. They describe how large the stimuli are. It's incredible detail, and that's intentional. Let's take a step back for a moment and talk about the major sections of the methods section. First, note that you may need to add sections or exclude sections based on the specifics of your study design. Step 1. From whom are you gathering your data? Who are your participants? Did the data come from an archival source? If you collected new data from new participants, tell me where you got them. This will involve saying things like 100 participants were recruited from flyers placed throughout the campus of a large metropolitan university in the Midwest. That phrasing ticks several boxes. I know how many participants were recruited, I know a bit about how they were recruited, and I know the setting. Now, one of the rules of writing a method section is to either state or imply the sampling method used. In this example, I don't specifically state that this is self-selection sampling, but it's implied based on the recruitment procedures I've already mentioned. Next, we would want to know about any exclusion criteria. For instance, participants were admitted into the study if they reported being in a long-term relationship and smoking more than 2 cigarettes per day. Now, any reader knows pretty specifically how I sampled my population and generally who was included in that sample. In some methods sections, you'll find researchers reporting all of the descriptive statistics for the sample. I'm not a big fan of this because I believe it's advantageous to write the methods section before you do the study and then make sure that you follow the methods section exactly. This helps to avoid accidentally playing with the data later or tweaking the study design in the middle of the study to find what you want. Next, you need to describe the protocol and study design carefully. Be specific. Whatever study design best fits your study, state it explicitly and make sure it's completely unambiguous. If you utilized an experimental design, describe the procedures in very fine detail. If you use something like vignettes, provide those in full if possible. If you use some other visual stimuli, consider providing the stimuli in the appendix or generally online somewhere to ensure that readers know that they can find the stimuli and replicate the study exactly. Many studies will also include questionnaires. Questionnaires are at great risk for measurement error, so you have to alleviate your readers' concerns about this. For each questionnaire, I recommend the following. Have a standalone paragraph for each measure. Be clear about what variable it is intended to be measuring. If the original authors provide some specific definition for the variable, include that in quotes and cite it. In the introduction, you'll often find a definition for the variable, so if the authors of the measure disagree with that definition, you want to make that clear. You want to make any of these discrepancies very clear. Also, be specific. Is this a measure that's meant to be consistent with a specific theory? And if so, which theory? And then cite the original authors of that theory. If you're only measuring one part of a variable, make that clear. For instance, social support can be instrumental or emotional, however this study is only focusing on emotional social support. In general, you also want to make sure that you are citing the specific study that designed the measure. If it was originally designed by one author and then adapted by another author, then say that and then cite both, and be clear about exactly which version you're using. How many items are in it? How do the respondents respond? Are they given a 9-point scale? Is it an agreement scale? Do they just answer yes or no? Also, tell the reader what the valence of the scale is. What I mean by that is, for instance, say something like 9 equals strongly agree, so that we know that higher values mean a larger amount on that variable, and lower values mean a lower amount of that variable. Consider giving a sample item. Help readers understand exactly what it is like to answer these questions. If you were the first to use the scale, make that clear. If you made changes to an existing scale, describe what those changes were, why you made them, and why that's still valid. If the scale is not previously published in the literature in full, and there are no copyright concerns, then consider including the scale in a table or in the appendix. Regardless of your measure, whether it's technological, observational, biometric, or psychometric, cite any validity evidence that currently exists in the literature. If there is none, it's probably important to say that. Also, always cite the reliability reliability evidence. If the authors, or anyone for that matter, report a Cronbach's alpha, report that. If more than one author has reported a Cronbach's alpha for that scale, report the range. If the authors conducted an exploratory factor analysis, state that, and explain how many factors they decided to extract. If the authors conducted a confirmatory factor analysis, state that, and consider reporting values like the RMSEA, the CFI, or the SR-MR values. You might want to include some others too, like a parsimony adjusted value, but remember that you are going to cite all of these papers, so if your readers want more detail, they can go and get it from the original source. Once you've provided all the detail you possibly could have for every single measure that you use, then move on to the data analytic strategy section. In this section, outline exactly what you will do in your data analyses, which statistical tests you'll use, which statistical software package you will use, which version you will use. If it contains packages like R does, then state exactly what those packages are and which versions those are. You'll also want to cite the manuals for any packages that you use. You also want to describe how you're going to deal with missing data. If you are sure you will not have any missing data, or you're sure that you don't, say that. If you have some missing data, describe how much, maybe as a percentage. If you have some missing data but you're only going to use the cases that provided complete data, that's called a complete case analysis, and you can use that phrasing. Again, report what percentage of your data is missing. If it is different for each variable, consider reporting those values in a range or a table. Then also describe your sample size analysis, if you did one, which you should. Describe all the parameters you provided for that sample size analysis, and be clear about the values that you received in return. One pro tip here, we tend to use 0.8 as the convention for power. Anything higher than that is well powered. If you are doing multiple statistical tests, describe how each is set up, and then consider referencing each hypothesis as it relates to each test. You might use that numbering system for hypotheses that I've mentioned in the past. For example, hypothesis 1 will be tested using a multiple linear regression, with X and Y as the predictors and Z as the outcome variable. If you use a statistical procedure that requires multiple steps or decisions throughout the process, describe how you will make those decisions and describe each of them in detail. If you're using multiple comparisons, describe what steps you'll take to deal with the multiple comparisons problem and any corrections you might make, like a Bonferroni correction. Phew, alright, I know that sounds like a lot, but remember that this is really important. We have to get into this fine level of detail about exactly how the study was conducted, because this is part of the transparency of the process of science, and it is essential that we demand transparency and clarity from all of our researchers.